these quiet woodlands, you can still find reminders of a great war. Shell holes left from fierce battles fought here long ago. Muddy trenches where thousands of men struggled to the death. Each year brings more reminders, a dangerous, often deadly, harvest of steel.
That's a German shell, 21 centimeters.
Rising up through the soil are thousands of high explosive shells that farmers leave by the side of the road, lethal relics of one of the bloodiest battles in history.
It's 3-4 kilometers from Passchendaele, so it can be from the big Passchendaele fight, one of the battlefields of Passchendaele.
Summer 1917, Flanders. British troops unload millions of shells, preparing for the battle that will go down in history under the name Passchendaele. The British Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, is about to launch his greatest offensive yet, to liberate northern Belgium from the Germans and seize its channel ports. Attacking from the city of Ypres, Haig plans to capture the German-held ridges around the city and to send his cavalry galloping through shattered German lines and on to victory. For 10 days, 4 million shells thunder down on a few square kilometers of Flanders. Ordered to resist to the last man, German troops, like 22-year-old Ernst Junger, can only hunker down and pray they will survive.
We lay close to one another in the narrow and crowded ditch. Fire danced before our eyes. Twigs and clods whistled about our ears. Close on my left, a flash flared out, leaving a white, suffocating vapor. I crept on all fours to the man next to me. He moved no more. The blood trickled from many wounds caused by small, jagged splinters.
But Haig's bombardment, the biggest of the war, destroys the centuries-old drainage system of Flanders. And within days, the rains begin, pouring down upon the Field Marshal's battlefield.
We're standing on one of the most bloody, deadliest, infamous battlefields in history. And today it looks like this. The shelling over this period had destroyed all the creeks and all the drainage, like the little rave beak that's beside us here. And it just turned the whole thing into a sea of mud, or a treacherous morass. And soldiers who fell off duckboards would drown in the mud.
Mud rips the treads off Field Marshal Haig's tanks. His guns sink. His men and his mules drown. Whole armies are swallowed up. And Douglas Haig's great offensive flounders in a sea of stinking slime. Stubbornly, Haig decrees that the offensive will continue, and so it does, for almost 3 months. By October, the Field Marshal has lost 250,000 men, and the key ridge overlooking the city of Ypres, the ridge of Passchendaele, is still in German hands.
We're standing on what were the German positions on Passchendaele Ridge. From here you can see Ypres 12 kilometers in the distance. And in these fields in 1917, the British Army suffered more than 250,000 casualties. Yet they had not reached this position. In mid-October 1918, Canadian troops were ordered north, and they were given the impossible task of capturing Passchendaele.
Since its victory at Vimy Ridge 6 months before, the Canadian Corps has been considered an elite force. But the price of victory had been heavy. Many are now new recruits, replacing the dead and the maimed. One of these fresh-faced rookies is a 22-year-old railway clerk from Ontario, John Harold Becker.
We were lined up for Ypres, and it had a bad reputation. Every minute brought us closer to the front and further into the great wastes that were Belgium. Tremendous traffic congested the road. Troops were everywhere, and the roadside estaminets were doing a thriving business. On the western edge of Ypres, we got out of our trucks and started our march.
When the Canadians enter Ypres, they can see for themselves how, after 3 years of war, the city has, like so much of the world, been reduced to rubble. Only soldiers trudge through the shattered streets. The population is gone. And of the world-renowned monuments, such as the Cloth Hall and the cathedral, only empty shells remain. The Gothic jewel of Flanders exists no more.
As we entered this city, we were spaced a considerable distance, each platoon moving by itself. There was only one route through Ypres, and this main road carried all the traffic to and from the great salient to the east. Every few minutes, a big shell landed somewhere in the neighborhood of the corner by the famous Cloth Hall, and at intervals, a whole salvo was planted in the city.
This is a large caliber German naval shell, one of the many types of shells that were lobbed on Ypres in 1915 and throughout the Great War. Fortunately, this one did not explode, because if it had, it would have blown out a big chunk of this building or made a crater about 25 feet wide.
When Agar Adamson, the commander of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, enters the desolate ruins of Ypres, his first concern is to find shelter for his men.
Dear Mabel, I shoved the men into what cellars could be found. I showed one of our new officers around the remains of the town. The shelling on both sides is most intense. The evening bombing accounted for some good dear fellows of another battalion. My love to you, ever thine, Agar.
This is Rampart Cemetery. It's at the southern end of Ypres, and it's one of the most beautiful cemeteries in the salient. This is the grave of Sapper Abe Borthwick of the Canadian Engineers, who was killed in action on the 16th of October 1917. Borthwick was one of the original men who came north from Vimy in preparation for the Passchendaele fighting. The men who came north, who had last been in Ypres in 1916, couldn't believe what they found here. It was all mud and total destruction, and the stench of death was everywhere. We're looking out over the moat here. This area was deadly. You couldn't show yourself during the day because of German shelling. There'd be bodies in the moats. The whole place was just demolished. It was hell on earth. The Canadian Corps were about 100,000 strong when they came north. The volunteers of 1914 were all dead or wounded or gone. And they brought up a new army, a very successful army, one that had won big victories at Vimy, Hill 70. This was a really cocky group, and these guys had a big challenge ahead of them when they came here at Ypres.
After a 3-month offensive, to save his career, Field Marshal Haig has to justify his huge casualties with at least one tangible success. He orders the commander of the Canadian Corps, Arthur Currie, to capture Passchendaele Ridge. Calculating that the ridge will cost 16,000 Canadian casualties, Currie declares that Passchendaele is not worth one drop of blood. Stubbornly, Haig insists. He orders Currie to attack, and finally Arthur Currie promises his Canadians will take Passchendaele. Only when they relieve the Australians and New Zealanders do the Canadians realize the full horror of the battle. The Anzacs had fought their way to the foot of Passchendaele Ridge, and there they had been slaughtered. 38,000 casualties. The survivors look more like ghosts than men.
Dear Mabel, the condition of the ground beggars description. Just one mass of shell holes, all full of water. The strongest and youngest men cannot navigate without falling down. The people we relieved tell me in the attack a great many of their men were drowned in shell holes for want of strength to pull themselves out when dog-tired. Ever thine, Agar.
The battlefield of Passchendaele. Kilometers of mud, a naked, barren morass, all of it exposed to German guns and bombers. Looking out over the wasteland, General Arthur Currie, the Canadian commander, realizes what faces him. Just to get to the foot of Passchendaele Ridge, he will have to build a network of floating plank roads. He puts the troops to work, and 22-year-old John Harold Becker finds himself in a work party.
Daily, we plugged up that road, past the labor battalions working to fill in the new shell holes, and trying to keep the soupy mud below ankle depth. Past broken wagons and guns, past ambulances going out with the wounded, past bodies of young Canadians, English, Scotch, Irish, and Australians, past the smells of rotting flesh, past bodies that were more recent casualties, but looked the same in the color of the mud, the color of the blood. Our own party usually numbered one or two less than on the ingoing trip. A big shell zoomed in right alongside our path, and cries went up for a stretcher bearer. 2 men were killed outright, and Lance Corporal Bottomley had his right arm almost torn off. When I got to him, he was standing there calmly with a tight hold on the stump of his arm just above the wound. The rest of the arm was hanging by a couple of tendons. When he left with the other wounded fellows, he called out a cheery goodbye.
When Becker dashes to shelter in an improvised trench, gas shells explode in front of him. With his face and body scalded by mustard gas, Becker can't breathe. He becomes just one more casualty. But he is lucky. Soon he's in an ambulance, and for Harold Becker, the Battle of Passchendaele is over. As the floating plank roads near completion, German air attacks intensify. Gotha bombers pound the Canadian road builders. Private Will Bird, a veteran of Vimy Ridge, is caught out in the open as the Gothas sweep out of the clouds.
At that moment, over came 2 big black-winged German Gothas and dropped bombs. Some ammunition mules were packed in line on a shaky board road made of planks, and one bomb made a direct hit on a broad mule rump. The Gothas flew off, and we saw men push the 3 dead mules into the mud. Shambles of head and entrails were shoveled into the mire, and then the ammunition train went on. We kept on and arrived at a battery of 5 guns. The battery horses had drowned in mire as they tried to move the guns to the left, where a slight rise afforded more solid ground. So now, 13 men of the 42nd took hold of the rope and tried to pull a gun. It was tremendous labor. Each man had to keep getting a new footing, and often we sank in mud and water of gruel thickness until the slime rose above our hips. The only thing solid underneath was a huddled dead man, and we stumbled over 5 or 6 during the morning.